Good afternoon. My name is Tracy Streeter and I'm with Burns & McDonnell. Joining me today is Councilman Bryan Frye with the City of Wichita. Our topic is financing for infrastructure and the historically low interest rates we're seeing today, primarily due to the pandemic. As the pandemic started in March, Burns & McDonnell started to engage in conversations about how the financial and economic recovery of our nation could include infrastructure. So to do that, we looked at our current state of water financing. Most of you are very familiar with the federal sources of funding on the left side of this slide, including the WIFIA SRF, community development block grants, and then the grants and loans through rural development and USDA. There's been some legislation and some activity during the pandemic. Much of it began before the pandemic and saw some traction after the pandemic was underway, primarily in the Senate with passage of two pieces of legislation in the Environment and Public Works Committee. And then the House Transportation Infrastructure also spent some time working on the Water Resources Development Act. None of those pieces of legislation have passed, and so we're looking to see those bills and some movement on those after the election and perhaps in the next session of Congress. So while we were talking about these existing pieces of legislation, there were also talks about could there be an infrastructure component to the stimulus packages that have been deliberated and passed through Congress and signed by the president. At the beginning of the pandemic, Burns & McDonnell sent a company-wide memorandum to members of Congress to discuss our recommendations for economic response. Burns & McDonnell being a company consisting of 10 global practices ranging from aviation to water, we tried to cover the gamut in our recommendations. So as we looked at the history of infrastructure in stimulus packages, we didn't have to go far. We looked back to the 2008 Recovery Act, and we all remember the term shovel ready back then. That was a major tenet of that package, that projects needed to be shovel ready to utilize those funds. While that makes all the sense in the world, there were some unintended outcomes in that there were some low priority projects funded because they were probably shovel ready and on the shelf for a reason, because they were maybe not the most urgent project for a municipality or utility. In lieu of that, we have been advocating for collaborative delivery and design build as an alternative to expedite project implementation while still being able to tackle our priority water infrastructure projects. So what's today's cost of money? Looking at the bond buyers index, which is the basis for some of our traditional financing, the general obligation bonds and revenue bonds, we've seen about a 20% reduction from a year ago to a recent week back in late September. So you can see the bond buyers index, even on traditional financing, is 20% better off than it was a year ago. The Federal Reserve has been aggressive from the get-go. We've seen these rates dip to near zero, and a lot of accounts I've seen since the pandemic has started is that these rates are going to stay that way for some time. And so that's really setting the stage for some very, very attractive interest rates. So let's look at an example, a $20 million project, be any project you want, but let's assume it's a wastewater project. If a utility would have financed a $20 million project a year ago using traditional financing, the rate was 3.73%. And the cost of that money over a 20-year repayment period would be $8.7 million. Today, the interest rate for those bonds is 2.22. And you can see the reduction in interest, 3.7 million, about a 13% reduction. Now let's fold in the subsidized loans through the SRF program. So you can see the previous example on the first two bars, and then you bring in SRF and you see an additional reduction in interest payment because that rate as of last month was 1.29% for the Kansas State Revolving Loan Program. So comparing 2019 traditional financing to today's SRF, you're seeing about a $6 million savings in interest over 20 years on a $20 million project. That's significant. So let's talk briefly about collaborative delivery and why that's advantageous during this time period. So I think we're all familiar with the traditional method of design, bid, build, where a designer or an engineering firm designs the project, hands it off to the owner then puts it out on the street for bids by a contractor. And then collaborative delivery has many different alternatives. You've got CMAR, construction manager at risk, fixed price design build, and progressive design build as 3 examples. So let's talk about the 2. What is design bid build? Puts the owner right in the middle between the designer and builder. And if you've ever been in that position, it can be very frustrating and very expensive and very slow. And really, it puts a lot of our utilities in something that's not, it's a foreign place for them because they have to kind of referee between the 2 entities that are involved in their project. It really results in some slower timelines for implementation, and in many cases, it results in increased costs. Design build consolidates the designer and the builder, as the name implies. What's good about that is the owner has to deal with one entity. It consolidates the whole process to one single point of accountability. So other reasons, when you look at the Water Design Build Council, they surveyed a number of owners and they got their opinions on what they like the most about design build. Single point of accountability is out there leading the way, but all of these different attributes of design build, ranging from lower cost and price certainty, are very important. And you'll hear Councilman Frye talk about a number of these in his comments here in a few minutes. So Penn State also looked at design build benefits and came up with a number of results that showed that shorter delivery cycle, shorter construction duration, and most importantly, what most folks are concerned about is lower construction costs. And again, as they looked at the projects in their survey, the design build outperformed the design build every time. And also, just as an aside, the Wichita ASR project, which was built several years ago, went through a design build process, and they achieved over $20 million in savings on that project. So that kind of concludes my general overview, but I want to yield the rest of the time this afternoon to Councilman Frye to talk about the Wichita Northwest Treatment Facility.
Appreciate that, Tracy. And this is a project that I'm very excited about. This is one of the things I campaigned on 5 years ago when I initially ran to serve on the Wichita Council, was taking care of our infrastructure and building a facility that can last the next several generations. So the Wichita Northwest Water Facility Treatment Plant is going to replace one that's lasted for 81 years. When you go into the existing water treatment facility and there's a plaque dedicated by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, you know this facility has stood the test of time. It's been around a long time. It's got some inherent problems in that it is the only water treatment plant for our region, about 500,000 users, 14 communities, all of our industry, our Air Force Base. There is no redundancy in this plant. So it's critical that we do something that's going to replace this plant, but also lock in some rate certainty for our users. We all know that water utility is something you have to have, but you also don't want to pay a fortune for it. And having some certainty on that price is very important for our citizens. So when we were just working on this project, we knew we had to have some things in place that could give us those assurances. So as I mentioned, this current plant has to be unique because we're taking water from multiple sources. Right now, we don't blend those sources. And again, there's no redundancy. So we've got about 200 million gallons of water per day that can come in to this new facility. And it's a blend of different things, from the Cheney Reservoir to the Equus beds under up north of town, and then different well fields. And so blending all those sources and making sure that we can treat them efficiently is key as we design this new plant. So as I mentioned, we have about 500,000 customers, 14 communities. It's almost 20% of the entire state. relies on Wichita Water Treatment Facility. So that's why this is such an important project. And again, this is a project that we've been working on for a very long time. We continue to pull millions of dollars into repairs to keep it going, sometimes even fabricating our own replacement parts because no one exists anymore that originated those parts. So it's been a very expensive project. We've known for some time that we have to do something different. And finally, in 2019, we decided on the phase that we're in right now with the design builder approach. And the elements that went into this are there on the screen. I mentioned earlier on that we really had to make sure that we knew what we were getting from a cost standpoint to give in some rate certainty for our users. And again, protecting that water treatment plant to make sure that it has redundancy, that has the ability to do different blends depending upon where the water's coming from. And again, knowing what that operation and maintenance is going to be over the long haul. Currently, it's a system of duct tape and baling wire to keep it going, and we know that operations have gotten much more sophisticated. But at the same time, we've got to make sure that what we're building is something that we can operate efficiently and not have escalating costs. So we started figuring out how we're going to pay for this. And we first learned of the WIFIA through the EPA, and we weren't successful out of the gate. We stumbled. We learned how to better write the application and working with our partners, and visits to DC to meet with EPA gave us better insight as to what we needed to do to have a successful application. And again, the cost savings is the main reason we're doing this. With the low interest rate through WIFIA, we're looking at 1.17% interest on a total project cost of $553 million. This low interest loan not only gives us rate certainty, but it also defers our payment 5 years until after construction is completed. So we have the time to build in that rate structure and not have huge spikes. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but to be able to keep an even, consistent rate structure without wild spikes, that was important as well. Being able to spread that over time. So with WIFIA, we've got about 49% of the loan. And then with the state revolving fund, it's about 48%. And those two things, just the WIFIA alone is going to save us $95 million over the course of the loan. And then SRF is going to also do it. When you compare this to traditional revenue bonds, which interest rates somewhere between 4 to 5% over the life of the loan, you're looking at a much larger number on the total cost in the life of debt. Just revenue bonds alone would be looking at over $1 billion. With the WIFIA and the SRF, we're looking at about $717 million. So that's nearly $400 million savings versus the old traditional way of doing things. So this is a great program that we've been able to really work through, and we've had great relationship with the EPA as we go through this project. And again, this just goes to what I was just speaking to as it relates to the repayment options, the low interest rates, and how it's split between the two. We still will use revenue bonds for a small percentage of it. That is not covered by WIFIA and SRF. But again, allowing us, because we're looking at a 5-year construction build, and then we don't start the loans until 5 years, the repayment until 5 years after the completion. So we're not going to have to repay this for 10 years, which allows us to build that rate structure a very flat level over time. And again, this shows you that without the WIFIA, we'd be looking at WIFIA or SRF, would be looking at 10%, 11% rate hikes for several years in a row. National average is about 6%. And so we're currently projecting a very flat 5% over the next 8 years or so. And then we drop down to 4%, and then eventually 3% over the life of this entire 20-year loan. So very important rate reductions. Again, that consistency, having that locked in price with our design build approach, knowing what our costs are going to be, figuring out efficiencies as we go through to maybe even drop these numbers lower. That's the beauty of the design build relationship. As they work through this plant and figure out new efficiencies and new operational models, there's the opportunity to maybe even save more money over time. So right now, having this rate certainty is very important for our ratepayers. And again, when you're looking at national averages of 6%, and later on we're looking at 3%, I think we're in a pretty good place. And again, when we're talking about how this impacts our ratepayers, when you look at their average residential bill annually, the difference between with WIFIA and SRF and without, it doesn't appear to be a big number right off the bat in 2020, $20 saving, $11 savings. But as you get further in, you're talking annually about $200, $300 for an average residential customer. Now consider our commercial customers and the impact that would have on their rates. Very significant. And so we're very excited about this project. This is the first funded project in Kansas for WIFIA, and so we're pretty excited about that. And it's also the largest drinking water project to date that WIFIA has funded. So again, we're raising a high bar, but we're pretty confident that the benefit to our ratepayers is definitely going to be realized and give them certainty over time. So that's my presentation. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions, hopefully more for Tracy than me, but I'm going to turn it over and we're happy to answer any questions.